Japan is a pacifist country preparing for war.
For the first time, Japan has a woman at the helm. Sanai Takaichi is now Japan's Iron Lady.
She said a Chinese attack on Taiwan could threaten Japanese survival and potentially trigger a military response from Tokyo.
Japan has just opened the door to selling lethal weapons on the global market for the first time since the Second World War.
That last bit, a plan to increase lethal weapons exports to more than a dozen countries around the world, is just the latest evidence we've seen of Japan trying to become a more capable, more self-sufficient fighting force. For example, Japan is, right now, taking part in war games with the US for the first time ever as a combatant, using a cruise missile to sink a minesweeper. Japan was recently accused by China of provoking it by sailing a warship through the highly contentious waters around Taiwan. And Japan just hosted formal talks with some 30 members of NATO in Tokyo, where one of the primary goals was figuring out how to partner entire defense industries with each other, working together to make weapons of war. That means the same company that makes Toshiba televisions and rice cookers, making autonomous hunting drones, the makers of the Mitsubishi Mirage, also making Mogami-class warships, Fujitsu, they make dot matrix printers, also a specialist in digital defense. Let me show you how Japan is reimagining its role in a world at war. The most recent political decision that brings Japan one step closer to building a more formidable military is the announcement that it wants to sell what it makes to the world. Until now, it's been illegal under Japan's own laws to do this because, until now, only these 5 categories of defense exports were effectively allowed to leave the country: search and rescue, transport, warning systems, surveillance, and minesweeping. But the Prime Minister has just announced, with an amendment to the rules, transfers of all defense equipment will, in principle, become possible. So, Japanese-made fighter jets, submarines, missiles, destroyers, they're all fair game, not just to make, but to sell and make money. Japan has even already pinpointed more than a dozen potential buyers, the countries it already has defense partnerships with, including the US, the major European military powers, and a whole slate of countries in the maritime heart of Asia, in China's shadow.
Partners around the world are realizing that this project to cooperate more in the production of defense articles is economically efficient and strategically indispensable.
By helping other countries with acquiring types of weapons, it's hoping that this could help provide deterrence against threats like China. And so in that regards, it does provide Japan a greater presence in the arms market that it has not had until now.
This is a major shift for a country whose pacifism is deeply embedded, made part of its constitutional DNA after the Second World War, where it actively moved away from maintaining war potential at all. Not a conventional one to be deployed, but rather strictly a self-defense force. That may soon change, and the country's Prime Minister, Sanai Takaichi, is the one many believe will make it happen.
And Sanai Takaichi has won Japan's snap election in what's being called a landslide.
She also wants to boost defence spending and build a military strong enough to deter Chinese threats to its islands.
One of the more serious and permanent changes Takaichi could make to the country would be to rewrite its constitution, specifically Article 9, which states the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes. We don't know how far she might go in changing that particular clause, but it's worth remembering this is all part of a longer trajectory that predates Takaichi. Just over 10 years ago, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe began dismantling what was a blanket ban on military sales. Fast forward about 9 years, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida would approve a change to allow Japanese manufacturers to sell deadly weapons, as long as they were selling a country's own weapons back to it under license, like Japan agreeing to sell to the US American-designed Patriot missiles, but built in Japan. The result of all of this, up to and including the most recent change to sell even more complex weapon systems abroad, is to gradually transform Japan, not just into a weapons dealer, but a weapons maker.
By producing equipment for overseas exports, it's hoping that it could prop up some of these smaller subcontractors and try to revitalize the defense industrial base in Japan.
It's funny to think that around the same time Mitsubishi was manufacturing cars like the Starion in the 1980s, it was also building on its factory floors a line of F-15 fighter jets. Or while Kawasaki was building ninja sport bikes and jet skis, which is where the generic term jet ski comes from, by the way. It was also building turboprop, anti-submarine, and surveillance aircraft like the P-3C Orion. But what these companies have lacked for decades was the incentive to scale, because the ban on selling outside of Japan meant they had very few customers.
There's a reason why Japan's defense market was small and defense industrial base is small, because it had only one customer, which is Japan's self-defense force.
For most of the last half century, these companies' only customer, the Japanese government, its total defense spending has been a fraction of a percent of the overall Japanese economy. It actually had a 1% cap on defense spending, in line with its official position of pacifism. And there was this weird chicken and egg thing happening, where having very few people to sell to meant companies relied very little on making weapons for their overall revenue, which led to a real lack of investment, R&D, scale, which meant lack of growth, higher costs, serving a very niche defense market, which is a fancy way of saying they didn't have many customers. And this self-reinforcing spiral just keeps going round and round.
You only have a very small sliver that comes from defense sales. And so because of that, you've had this reliance on just the one customer, self-defense forces. And because of the higher costs and the limited number of orders, a lot of these smaller subcontractors that were relied on for just producing one or two components for a larger platform, they have gone out of business. They've left the market because it's just not profitable for them. There is a concern among some within the defense industries that if they push more towards weapons, that it could have negative implications on their non-defense sales. And that's where this merchant of death moniker comes up, where they're afraid that the public will look at them as peddling in death.
But Japan has gradually been trying to turn this mentality around. In 2024, look how small a piece of the global arms pie Japan represented, just 2% compared to bigger players like Russia, the UK, China, and the US. But consider another way of looking at those same countries. These bars chart growth. Japan's top 5 defense industry players in 2024 registering a staggering 40% growth over the previous year, totaling revenues just over $13 billion US, driven primarily by strong domestic demand amid Japan's ongoing military buildup program. Today, Japan produces locally all of the country's warships and submarines, even if they're often fitted with American parts and systems. But production is more and more in-house, culminating now in the biggest business deal in modern Japanese defense history. A deal worth $7 billion to provide Australia with 3 Mogami-class frigates, designed especially for ship-to-ship combat, made in Japan.
The fact that Japan got this deal with Australia for frigates, both selling them some and then jointly producing them, it is a very big deal, because I think most people were looking at Japan's entrance into the defense export market to start small. To go straight to these frigates is actually a very big deal.
The most recent estimates I've seen are that Japan's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is now just outside the top 30 weapons manufacturers in the world by revenue. And according to its most recent annual report, its integrated defense and space division accounts for more than 800 billion yen's worth of business, around 5 billion USD, making everything from planes to ships, missiles, torpedoes, even tanks.
Lifting the, lethal weapons export ban, right, it certainly could be seen as Japan, entering a new era, and I think sort of formalizing many of the developments and policy shifts that it's been doing more incrementally over the last several years.
Now, the position of the Takaichi government is that this shift is as necessary as it is inevitable, that the world has changed an awful lot in the last 80 years, and maybe especially since Trump first took office almost 10 years ago now. But the multi-billion-dollar question we'll be asking for years to come, does Japan's shift to a stronger war footing make Japan safer, or does it just add to all of the ways in which the world has simply become more dangerous?